Good morning, everyone, and thanks for letting me be part of this conference for the second time. This year, talking about transmission of alphabets, which is a great part of my PhD dissertation that I've just defended. Scripts in contact, the transmission of the first alphabets. At first, it seems to me useful to find out what is an alphabet. Since the answer of that question is not straightforward as it might appear, since even modern orthographic systems, which we tend to think as alphabets, can allow additional signs or grapheme, as ideogram or logogram, and just think about the emojis. From a linguistic point of view, I think there can be several ways to make the signs represent the language. Some types of notation can break language into small units, for example, a sign for a whole syllable, or a sign for a single phoneme, or a sign for a single phone. Either case, this involves an attempt to represent the phonological repertoire of the language. Here we will concentrate on the first alphabets, as I call them in the lecture in the title of this lecture. And I think that also this point is difficult to make since the development of the alphabet in the Levant during the second millennium remains even today ill-defined due to the rare and sporadic nature of the evidence. But today it is clear that this was a time of experimentation in which several variants of linear alphabets were used that will be gradually developing into the recognizable repertoire that will be then standardized in the early Phoenician around the first millennium BC. I remember that here we have an example of linear alphabet of the second millennium BC. This is a tablet from Ugarit, then an example, a very next example of alphabetic uniform. And we are here. Then, by this, with first alphabets, I then refer to Greek, Italic, and Anatolian alphabets, namely the Phrygian, the Lycian, the Carian, and the Lydian alphabets. So with Anatolian, I mean the geographic location, not the linguistic affiliation, which would exclude the Phrygian alphabet, since Phrygian is not an Anatolian language. And with first, I mean chronologically speaking, since their evidence are at the moment the most ancient. The movements of the alphabet has been often presented as unidirectional from the Levant to the Mediterranean via the Greeks and Romans across Europe. However, the adaptations of alphabetic writing in the Iberian Peninsula show that there was potential and space for drastic changes to the whole system. Such developments highlight the fact that movements and adaptations of writing do not follow predetermined trajectories, but rather are dependent on linguistic and practical sociocultural factors. However, this does not mean that changes in writing are the reflection of increase or decrease of social progress or even literacy. Nowadays, according to the common opinion, the alphabet was introduced to Greece via the Phoenicians in or shortly before the 8th century BC. Recently, new discoveries and archaeological evidence have revealed trade contact between the Aegean and Eastern Mediterranean, showing that the necessary infrastructure for a transmission of the alphabet was already in place long before the traditional date of its introduction. And linguistic and epigraphic, but should I say now also græfemic and græfematik studies have shown that the only argument for a late introduction is now the absence of evidence. So, so-called an argumentum ex silentio. And that the Eurocentric view, in which the West is seen as the only agent in world history, is just a product of its time, now absolutely outdated. In the present, a new approach, which allows an early date for the introduction of the alphabet and a less decisive role for the Greek in the transmission, help to understand relation between the first alphabetic scripts. What remains? Still unaddressed is some peculiarity, still unsolved, not unaddressed, is some peculiarity of the Asia Minor alphabets that still constitute arguments for the Greek thesis. The still unsolved enigma are, for instance, the Carian graphemes resembled Greek graphemes with deviant sound values, for which the so-called chaos hypothesis has been proposed. So then the Greek graphemes were just randomly attributed to phonetic value. Here we can see 4 Carian graphemes that have only formal equals in Greek and for which the chaotic hypothesis has been proposed. But below you can see that there are also examples of Carian grapheme equal in shapes and sound value to the Greek ones, so for which the chaos hypothesis does not work. Then we would see the case of Lycian vowels graphemes, which resembled formally the Greek ones, but phonologically have different values. For this reason, and to hold the Greek intermediation, the Lycian vowel graphemes should represent intermediate sound values, strange vowel sounds, which can be avoided comparing them to the Greek once again, but in the context, the script context must have been, so Anatolia, then Anatolian Greek. But we will see this example later. And from Etruscan, we can see the most visible problem in the thesis of the Greek role as intermediate, since Etruscan retain both the sigma and the sun for sibilants, which are the sigma and the sun are the Phoenician graphemes for the sibilants. And whereas none of the Greek alphabets contains both of these letters. The above fact, but also others, are hard to reconcile with the current paradigm, and so a different scenario has been suggested, in which the Anatolian, Italic, and Iberian alphabets are not derived from the Greek alphabets, as you can see here in the B scheme. The A is the previous one, the common. The B scheme is the new one, the new proposed. What still remain unaddressed is the mode or the modes of the transmission. And here we are to the main topic of my lecture. Here I've tried to find evidence from ancient literature about how they used to teach to write and read. From anthropology studies about how and even why in the first millennium we find predominant the alphabet, but at the same time several varieties of the alphabet, and then from cognitive studies about the dynamics of oral production, word recognition, and written word production. From an anthropological point of view, the case of the alphabet is a very nice example of transmitted tradition through space and time. For centuries, the dominant view here was that imitation makes the chain of transmission possible. Now it is proposed that what makes tradition live is not a general purpose of imitation, because cultural transmission is partial, selective, and even often unfaithful. And they read the quote here, some traditions live on in spite of this because they tap into widespread and basic cognitive preferences. This attractive tradition spread not by being better retained or more accurately transferred, but because they are transmitted over and over. And I think that this new approach held the chance to see the predominant role of the alphabet in the story of writing, and in particular in the first millennium in Greece, Italy, and Anatolia, that is due to the fact that this kind of notation has been adapted every time to each different cultural environments. This point also reinforces the assumption that transmissions means adaptation, and since, and they quote commas here, linguistic interpretation of graphic symbols always begin in the context of and for a particular language, in the adaptation process, there must be some linguistic reason to see. In our context, thanks to the lexical root structure of Semitic languages, we can remember that Semitic alphabets did not need vowel graphemes. On the contrary, Indo-European languages needed vowels graphemes to mark their morphemic contrast. Now we can see from ancient literature, where I have found only two evidence in Latin and in Greek literature that explain the mode of transmission. From the Greek literature, I found Dionysius of Halicarnassus, from the Periton Atticon Rhetoron, and I'm going to read the translation. At first, we learn the names of sounds elements, which are called letters, grammata. Then we learn their shapes and sound values, dynamis. And in Latin, we see Quintilianus from the Institutio Oratoria. At any rate, I'm not satisfied with the course, which I note is usually adopted, of teaching small children the names and order of the letters before their shapes. Such a practice makes them slow to recognize the letters, since they do not pay attention to their actual shape, preferring to be guided by what they have already learned by rote. From this to description, I think it is clear that teaching was at first conducted orally, repeating letters' names, then visually writing letters' shapes, and at the same time orally repeating their sounds. It is likely that this was the method commonly used in antiquity, since the name itself of the alphabet, which came from the first, the names of the first two letters, alpha and beta. These two rappers then, about the mode of transmission and teaching, highlight, I think, the importance of the underlying cognitive process in the spelling and in the visual and motoric composition. Then, from the cognitive point of view, some recent studies on dysgraphia in alphabetic and logographic writing system, especially Chinese, have been used to categorize the mistakes in syllabographic and logographic writing system in old text. For our context, recently this has been done for Hittite and Luwian, then Anatolian language of the second millennium BC. Here, I try to apply This theoretical frame, based upon Caramazza-Miceli 1990 and other famous studies that you can see in the bibliography, on contact and then transmission of scripts, which in this case, in our case, are alphabets. Here is the meaning of the title, indeed, Scripts in Contact, as the contact must have been in people speaking more than one language, which in our case, one of them were for sure Semitic and one Indo-European. The location of the contact must have been indeed the speakers. Here, the schematic representation of the spelling process reported in Caramazza-Miceli 1919, which in our case of scripts contact must be adapted at the moment of the transmission of the alphabet between at least two different languages, then different phonologies, then taking into account different phonologies. The first part here is the core moment of the transmission that allow the same script to represent another language. So I think when the so-called language fit of the script actually proves itself. The phoneme-grapheme conversion happened in the reading moment of the letters' names, and the orthographic output lexicon when the lexical letters' names are memorized in the short-term memory, the STM. This is exactly the first moment of the teaching method as appear in the ancient source, the Greek and the Latin ones that we have just discussed before. Below, the grapheme level representation is the visually representation of the letters' names as perceived orally and as memorized by the STM, the short-term memory. Now, we don't know the original Semitic names of the letters, but we do know how the Greeks adopted them, and surely they didn't have any meaning in the Greek language. And we should assume the same situation for the Asia Minor alphabets. So in this moment, the letters' names have been transmitted as they were in the Semitic language of origin. Then these names have been taken as loanwords. So words adopted from one language and incorporated in another language without any translation. I think that it is precisely the absence of word meaning that could have disrupted the lexical orthography and then the phonological processing of the acrophonic value that results in our alphabets. The second part here, below the grapheme level representation, is the moment of the reproduction. In there, we distinguish the oral reproduction and the written reproduction. For this letter, it can admit a graphemic buffer here, a failure, so to speak, of the STM, of the short-term memory, that temporarily holds graphemic representation for subsequent spelling process, as can be allographic conversion. This point can explain, for example, all the difficulties to count the exact number of letters. In our case, I think of the Carian alphabet, for instance, because in Carian we see divergence in the graphemic representation of many letters, of the same letters many times. At the level of the letters' names, the pronunciation of them are analyzed through or not the phonological mediation of the second language and stored in a graphemic output lexicon, GOL, which determines its written implementation in comparison to the model of the first language. In our case, we should assume that phonological mediation produce the different sound value for the same letters in the languages involved. This phenomenon is particularly clear for vowel signs between Lycian and Greek. Here you can see a scheme, and I'm sorry for the Italian indication, but it's from my PhD thesis, that illustrates the vowels grapheme for A, E, and I in Greek and Lycian, and also their Semitic model. You can easily see their visual similarities in their shapes, but these are not reflected by the phonological reality of these languages. For instance, the case of the arrow grapheme, this, common use in other languages also has been indicated as an AI, so an intermediate sound between A and E due to the correspondences in Greek. As you can see, the Lycian arrow seems to be the equal of alpha, epsilon, and eta in Greek. However, the context of the contact should have been Asia Minor. Then the phonology to take into consideration should be Anatolian Greek, for which there has been already studied exactly the alternation between alpha, epsilon, and eta, here by Briggs, who talk about Anecol influence, for which for our topic is even more interesting, which would explain the correspondence between one Lycian grapheme, the arrow, and even 3 different Greek graphemes, since in Anatolian Greek already there are these alternations. And then there has been studied another alternation in Anatolian Greek between epsilon and iota, which helped the scholars to say that epsilon and iota in Anatolian Greek must represent the same sound value. So more I than E. Here you can see some example of this alternation between epsilon and iota. And this fact could have caused the choice of the Greek alpha for the Lycian E, I mean the arrow, because the Lycian arrow represents indeed E. So since alpha seemed, the Greek alpha seemed nearer to E sound than the epsilon. This example shows in synchronic adaptation, so not in the diachronic adaptation of the alphabets, and in particular with onomastics, which remains the main and most reliable source for phonologic studies in Asian languages. And returning to our scheme, to the scheme of the spelling process, for the oral reproduction, it should be considered 2 kinds of input. So, auditory and visual input. Here the scheme from Nichols Howard Best, 1997. At first, we can admit the auditory input, for which the phonological information gains direct access to the phonological short-term store, the PSTS, which is responsible for the speech output lexicon here, the SOL. Whereas written words, so visual input, must be recorded by the articulatory loop in order to be held in a PSTS. Once these new alphabets acquired a certain degree of complexity, they became more and more associated with the language. And at this point, I think the adaptation would involve also addition of new signs for phonemes or for phones that were still not represented, either with the creation of signs completely new or with the modification, implementation of signs that are already part of the alphabet. And here you can see some example from the current alphabet. And you can see here the D graphemes, the B graphemes, and the ch, the palatal, the voiceless palatal graphemes, which could be the source for these three other graphemes, for this grapheme which could represent in D or in T. There's a problem of voice or voiceless. And this from B to MP, MB, and this from ch, k, there's a problem for the palatal or velar sound. For the nk, there's no example for ng, so I've not put here the voiced sound. This is just a thought. I think this can be the proof, for example, this can be the proof of the link between the graphomotor processing and the spelling during the learning of writing. But this is another topic. For the moment, thank you very much for your attention, and I wait for your advice and suggestion and question. Thanks.